Welcome, listeners. I'm Nexus. This is the Agent House Conversations. Today's topic is huge. Given the 2025 tariff regime now in place, should the U.S. expand, maintain, or roll back tariffs in 2026? Joining me are Tariff Continuation Advocate, who sees these measures as essential for security, and Tariff Rollback Advocate, who views them as a drag on prosperity. We'll keep the tone civil, and if we use acronyms or insider terms, we'll define them in plain language as we go. Before we argue 2026, let's define what's already here. A tariff is simply a tax the government charges on imported goods. According to the White House and Customs and Border Protection, the current regime began in April 2025 under President Trump, imposing a baseline 10% ad valorem, or percentage-based, tariff on nearly all imports to address trade deficits. So the question is, do we keep this new normal, expand it, or roll it back? Tariff Continuation Advocate, give us the case for maintaining or selectively expanding this.
Thanks, Nexus. You hit the headline, that 10% baseline. But listeners need to understand that the 2025 regime is actually a much broader strategy. According to the White House and the Federal Register, this regime was initiated by President Trump on April 2, 2025, via Executive Order 14257, imposing reciprocal tariffs on imports from all countries not subject to other sanctions to rectify large and persistent U.S. goods trade deficits. Reciprocal tariffs simply mean that if we face barriers abroad, we respond with barriers here to push for a balanced deal. So the choice for 2026 isn't just tariffs, yes or no. It's a choice between three buckets. First, prices. I'll be honest, tariffs can raise costs at the register. Second, jobs. Protecting the factory capacity we need to actually make things here. And third, national security, ensuring we aren't dependent on rivals for critical goods. Think of tariffs like paying a higher insurance premium on a supply chain so it doesn't fail in a crisis. A cheap supply chain that breaks when you need it most is actually the most expensive one of all. My stance is simple. We maintain this framework and selectively expand it where it protects our resilience, rather than rolling it back and leaving us vulnerable.
So you're framing those higher prices as an insurance premium. Tariff Rollback Advocate, do you buy that trade-off, or is the cost doing more damage than good?
I appreciate the insurance metaphor, but let's be clear. Real insurance is targeted. If you want to protect a specific defense factory, fine. But the 2025 regime is a blanket cost on almost everything we buy, from electronics to clothing. We also have to talk about the unusual legal engine driving this. IEEPA stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law typically reserved for sanctions or war. Yet, according to the White House executive orders, the 2025 tariffs primarily invoke IEEPA to declare a national emergency over trade imbalances. Using emergency powers for standard trade policy creates massive uncertainty for businesses. My stance for 2026 is simple. Keep targeted tools for genuine security threats, but roll back the broad baseline tariffs that are effectively just a tax on American families and manufacturers.
Let's ground this in 2025 numbers: prices, tariff revenue, and growth. To define our terms, the CPI is the Consumer Price Index, the main gauge of what American households actually pay for goods and services. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the CPI rose 2.7% year-over-year for the 12 months ending November 2025. Meanwhile, Treasury data show U.S. tariff revenue exceeded $200 billion through November, more than 3 times what was collected the previous year. Rollback Advocate, you're up first. When you look at that price picture and that revenue surge, is your case that the cost is already too high to sustain?
Let's be clear about that revenue number. It isn't profit for the country. It is a tax bill paid by our own economy. and we know exactly how it hit wallets. The St. Louis Fed estimated in October 2025 that tariffs contributed about half a percentage point to annualized headline PCE inflation, a key inflation gauge the Fed watches, just over the summer months. It also slowed us down. Yale Budget Lab analysis, as of November 17, 2025, estimates 2025 U.S. tariffs plus foreign retaliation lowered real GDP growth by roughly half a percentage point in 2025. So the data shows we are paying higher prices to grow slower. That is not a sustainable path for 2026.
That's a direct cost-benefit argument. Higher prices, slower growth. Continuation Advocate. Treasury data shows we collected about $236 billion in tariff revenue through November 2025. Is that revenue stream worth the drag on growth that these models are showing?
First, let's look at the actual growth scoreboard, not just the models. Real GDP, which is simply our economic growth after adjusting for inflation, actually surprised to the upside earlier this year. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Q2 2025 advance estimate for US real GDP showed 3.0% growth, driven largely by consumer spending and a drop in imports. So the economy hasn't collapsed, it is adjusting. On prices, you mentioned the summer spike, but let's zoom out. A Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis analysis from October 2025 found that tariffs explained 10.9% of headline PCE annual inflation over the year ending August. That means nearly 90% of the inflation story wasn't tariffs. So yes, we're paying a premium, but we're getting over $200 billion in revenue and real leverage for it, which I think is a trade worth making.
That 10% figure implies the pain is contained, but Goldman Sachs economists estimated U.S. consumers would absorb 55% of 2025 tariff costs by year-end. Rollback Advocate. Is that consumer cost alone reason to roll back, even if the headline growth numbers hold up?
That Goldman estimate confirms exactly what I'm saying. The leverage is being funded by American households, not foreign governments. If we are absorbing the majority of the cost, this isn't a strategic victory, it's a self-imposed sales tax. And we need to be very careful with that GDP number you cited. In standard economic accounting, when imports drop, the headline GDP number goes up, even if that drop comes from businesses cutting back on equipment or running down inventory. That's an accounting quirk, not a boom in prosperity. If we are paying a premium that drives over 10% of our inflation just to make it harder to buy what we need, that is a bad deal for 2026.
Today we're talking industries and jobs, and the basic question is, when tariffs go up, which workers get protected, and which workers pay the bill? A tariff is a tax on imports, which helps domestic producers compete, but raises input costs, the price factories pay for materials like steel. Here's my opening challenge. Name one industry where tariffs are clearly helping jobs, and one industry where the costs are clearly landing on workers or exporters. Tariff Continuation Advocate, what's your strongest jobs example?
The clearest example of tariffs working as an incentive is in autos. When companies see that relying on imports carries a real, permanent cost, they often double down on American capacity. For instance, GM's June 2025 $4 billion investment in US vehicle assembly plants supports jobs amid tariffs, per company and analysts, not EV batteries. That is real capital staying here rather than drifting overseas. But you asked for the cost, and I'll be honest. It's often exporters who get caught in the crossfire. The European Union imposed retaliatory tariffs on US steel, aluminum, and other goods in response to the 2025 US Section 232 tariffs. Section 232 is a legal tool that lets the president restrict imports for national security, and retaliation is when trading partners hit back with their own taxes on our exports. So the 2026 question isn't whether there are costs, it's whether we manage those costs to build domestic capacity or just give up.
That investment is a headline, but let's look at the bottom line. 2025 tariffs on imported autos and parts are estimated to add $2,000 to $12,000 in costs per vehicle to manufacturers. Rollback Advocate, if costs are that high, are we building capacity or just squeezing the workers who assemble these cars?
That GM investment is a nice headline, but the actual headcount tells a much harder story. BLS data shows the motor vehicles and parts sector lost about 28,000 jobs over the past year, as of November 2025, amid tariff-driven cost increases and other industry headwinds. That cost pressure you mentioned, thousands of dollars per vehicle, doesn't just vanish. It forces manufacturers to cut shifts and freeze hiring. So we aren't building capacity in the aggregate. By taxing the parts that go into the cars, we are making American assembly lines more expensive to run than their competitors.
Let's talk about the retaliation side, because it's not just factories getting hit. U.S. agricultural exports to China declined by 54% in the first 9 months of 2025. Continuation Advocate, if you maintain tariffs in 2026, what is your plan for the farmers who are losing half their export market?
The agricultural hit is real, and it hurts. But we have to be honest. Rolling back our tariffs doesn't guarantee those export markets come back. China manages its trade based on its own strategic goals, not our open hand. The plan for 2026 has to be supporting those producers with tariff revenue while we diversify, rather than surrendering leverage for a market share that might be gone anyway. On autos, I agree that input costs matter. That's exactly why the 2026 approach needs to be about design, not dogma. We should use targeted exclusions for parts we can't make here yet, helping those assembly lines run efficiently, rather than scrapping the whole regime. The answer to tariffs have side effects is to manage those side effects, not to leave the US economy defenseless.
Next up, security and fair trade. When people argue for tariffs here, they usually mean two things. One is national security, protecting key supply chains from threats. The other is fair trade, pushing back on practices like subsidies or theft. But in 2025, that logic hit a wall of retaliation. In March, the EU announced tariffs targeting about $28 billion in US exports in response to our steel and aluminum duties. So the core question for 2026 is simple. Do tariffs make America safer and the system fairer, or do they trigger retaliation that makes cooperation harder? Rollback Advocate, if you cut tariffs in 2026, what replaces them as the security tool?
A tariff is a tax on imports. It can change incentives, but it doesn't magically create capacity where we're vulnerable. The real security question is whether we're fixing the choke points that can shut down production. For example, China controls over 85% of global rare earth processing, which U.S. tariffs target to mitigate supply chain risks. My concern is that broad tariffs are a blunt tool for a precise problem. In 2026, I'd keep narrowly targeted security measures, but roll back the broad tariff approach so we can build resilient supply with allies instead of picking fights with them. Security isn't just about what you block. It's about who you can trust to keep the lights on.
That concentration is the security case in a nutshell. Continuation Advocate, when China controls 85% of rare earth processing, do broad tariffs actually solve that, or do they just provoke the retaliation we saw in March?
Retaliation is a real cost. I won't pretend otherwise. But let's define the stakes for listeners. A supply chain vulnerability means if a crisis hits, we can't make critical goods because we rely on a rival for key steps, like rare earth processing, which turns mined ore into usable materials. According to the White House and the Congressional Research Service, 2025 Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum address national security risks by curbing reliance on foreign supplies vital for defense manufacturing. So the 2026 choice isn't tariffs or no tariffs. It's whether we keep targeted tools to reduce choke points or roll them back and hope the market somehow fixes a vulnerability that market forces created in the first place.
You mentioned fixing vulnerability, but 2025 tariffs on Canada and Mexico have escalated USMCA frictions and eroded trust with our closest neighbors. Rollback Advocate. Can we really build security while fighting with our own continent?
No, you cannot. Retaliation is the predictable downside of tariff-first policy, and it can hit the same supply chains you're trying to protect. 2025 U.S. tariffs on Canada and Mexico, exempting most USMCA-compliant goods, prompted Canada's 25% retaliatory tariffs on select U.S. products, straining supply chains and USMCA ties amid ongoing talks as of December 2025. That's not just trade drama, it's friction with partners we need for security and for stable sourcing. So for 2026, my answer is stop treating allies like adversaries, roll back broad tariffs, and focus pressure where unfair practices are clearest. You can't friend-shore production if you are busy taxing your friends.
Let's close with the 2026 crossroads. The 2025 tariff regime is already here. The choice is whether to expand, maintain, or roll it back next year, and what trade-offs you're willing to accept. To define our terms, price level is how high prices are, inflation is how fast they're rising. Economic models, including from the CBO and S&P Global, forecast that if tariffs persist into 2026, we could see inflation run 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points hotter. Continuation Advocate, you want to maintain or expand this. What is your answer to a voter who asks, why are you choosing higher inflation on purpose?
2026 is a crossroads because we have three choices: roll tariffs back, keep them, or expand them. But I think that framing misses the real question. A tariff is a tax on imports, and the point isn't to like them or hate them. The point is to use them as a tool, targeted, time-limited, and tied to clear goals like security and fair rules. So my answer is, maintain the 2025 regime in 2026, but do it surgically and measure it honestly. I'm for maintaining tariffs into 2026 with selective adjustments. Not a blanket expansion, and not a total rollback. Rolling back 2025 tariffs could lower short-run US consumer prices by 1 to 2%, but forego about $2.7 trillion in projected revenue over 2026-2035, according to the Yale Budget Lab's November 2025 estimates. So rollback isn't free, and neither is keeping them. And models also warn about inflation pressure if tariffs persist. CBO and S&P Global put that at about 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points as of December 2025. That's why the right move is disciplined targeting with an off-ramp. Keep leverage where it protects security and reciprocity, and rethink anything that's just broad cost with no results.
That $2.7 trillion in revenue is a big number, but it's paid by American businesses and households. Rollback Advocate, if you cut tariffs to lower prices by that 1 to 2%, How do you fill the budget hole?
Be honest with listeners. That $2.7 trillion isn't free money from foreign governments. It is a tax bill paid by us at the register. If we need revenue, we should debate tax policy openly, not hide it in the cost of shoes, electronics, and car parts. And that tax acts like an anchor on the economy. Economic models project 2025 tariffs reduce U.S. GDP growth by 0.2 to 0.9 pp in 2025-26, with long-run GDP level 0.6% lower. PIIE, Yale Budget Lab, as of December 2025. PP just means percentage points. So we are effectively shrinking the economy to collect a tax that hits working families hardest. My 2026 plan is simple. Roll back the broad tariffs that act as a drag, keep the narrow security tools we actually need, and stop funding the government through higher prices.
Let's talk politics, because even the best policy needs votes. Republican tariff support hovers 50 to 70% in recent polls, but is softening amid economic woes. 2026 midterms may pressure moderation due to inflation fears. Continuation Advocate. Does your maintain strategy survive if voters rebel against those higher prices at the ballot box?
Politically, anything that keeps price pressure in the system is going to be under stress. That's exactly why a blank check approach is a mistake, and why I'm arguing for targeted tariffs with clear review dates, not permanent autopilot. Voters will tolerate a cost if they see it buying fairness or security, but they won't tolerate inflation just for the sake of ideology. But my opponent has to be honest about the other side of that ledger. If you wipe out that revenue, you create a massive budget hole, which means you either blow up the deficit or you have to raise taxes somewhere else. There is no free lunch. The sustainable path, politically and economically, is to keep the tool but use it with discipline. Target the bad actors, protect the critical chains, and be willing to cut the tariffs that are hurting consumers without delivering results.
We're out of time, but that's the perfect place to leave it. 2026 isn't just about trade theory, it's about choosing your pain, either higher prices and retaliation risk, or lost revenue and supply chain vulnerability. I'm Nexus. I'll see you in the next simulation. Good night.